Let's start the way we always do. Given the skyrocketing rates of loneliness, depression, anxiety, and suicide since the release of the first iPhone in 2007 and Android phone a year later, we can say that our first attempt as human beings at creating healthy social relationships has largely failed. I'm Dr. Anthony Silard, your host of ReSocial. Are you the type of person who values nothing more in your life than your close relationships? If you are, ReSocial was created for you. We bring in the top thought leaders in the world at the nexus of research and practice to help you rediscover, reflect on, and renew the CMSRs, the compassionate, meaningful, sustainable relationships in your life. Let's get started so you can create the life you have imagined, a life filled with CMSRs. Many of our listeners spend their working lives managing how they appear to others, monitoring their emotions, controlling their responses, sometimes faking what they actually feel just to fit in at work. And if you're a woman navigating midlife, you're often managing something else entirely, your body's own rebellion in the form of hot flashes, brain fog, or sudden emotional shifts. You're working twice as hard and getting half the credit. Today, we're talking about the hidden cost of that effort and what it means for our connections to ourselves and to each other. Hello, I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Silard, and welcome to ReSocial, where we rediscover, reflect on, and renew how we approach social interactions so we can develop CMSRs, compassionate, meaningful, sustainable relationships. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Alicia Grandey, a distinguished professor of psychology at Penn State University and the author of Emotionally Charged. Alicia's research over the past quarter century has fundamentally changed how we think about emotional authenticity in the workplace. And that 100% includes me. I've been following Alicia's work for really about 15 to 20 years. And for all of you listeners out there, I want you to know Alicia is one of the top, if not probably the top researcher that's working today around how we regulate and monitor and express our emotions in the workplace. So Alicia's here to talk about why we're all paying a price we barely notice and what liberation looks like when we stop paying it. Dr. Alicia Grandey, welcome to ReSocial.
Thank you for having me, Anthony.
Yeah, I'm really happy that you're here. So let's dive in, Alicia. So you've spent your career studying what happens when people cannot be themselves at work. Then you lived through it yourself, dealing with gender pay inequity, injustice, the invisible demands of appearing fine when you're not. How did your own experience change what you wanted to study?
Yeah, I'm a firm believer in the idea that research is me search. I think it gives us that passion and that personal investment to see research from the beginning to the end. And it's a long slog, to do a scientifically rigorous study. So in the early years of my life post college, I was working in a lot of customer service jobs. I worked in retail, I worked at Starbucks, and I was exhausted at the end of the day. And I didn't really understand why, because I'm just, working service is supposed to be easy. A service with a smile, it's what women are supposed to be good at, right? And then I read the book by Arlie Hochschild on the managed heart. And it suddenly all clicked, right? That this emotional labor that I was doing is devalued. It's not recognized, but it was definitely taking a toll. So that interest actually, in fact, I just came across a paper I wrote in 1994 on her book that I then turned into my dissertation and have been studying ever since. So it's been a through line of my work, understanding how managing and regulating our emotions, even in the face of mistreatment and inequity, is a challenge and takes a toll, but there are ways we can do it more effectively. And then, as you mentioned, thinking about women's bodies, that, again, research is me search. As I was starting to go through menopause, I was realizing we don't have a lot of work on that in our field to understand how women manage it in the workplace. And so that became a new direction where I could use my platform, my voice, my privilege as a really overeducated middle-aged woman to raise up the voice of others that maybe feel like they are not being heard.
And I remember Arlie Hochschild's The Managed Heart also influenced me a lot, and as did your research. I kind of read them side by side. And then I remember seeing you in Seattle at the Academy of Management, and you gave this wonderful presentation on your research into the 3 M's, menstruation, maternity, and menopause, and how it reveals that most workplaces treat these biological realities as embarrassments that need to be kind of, we don't talk about those, right? And kind of swept under the carpet. Well, where did this taboo come from, and what does it cost women when they feel they have to hide their own bodies in the workplace?
Yeah, where does any taboo come from, right? Like we have so many topics that you're told not to talk about: religion, politics, and sex, right? But really anything that is personal is not supposed to be in the professional space. Anything that is personal to you. And so the female bodily changes are part of that. I think we know that what is considered taboo and not to be discussed is dependent on who's in power. And if it makes them uncomfortable, then we're not supposed to talk about it. So I have no problem talking about the 3Ms, but perhaps people who are less familiar with them may not feel comfortable. And thus it's taboo because by talking about it, we might make other people feel uncomfortable due to their either lack of familiarity or their unwillingness to try to understand the experience. And then more broadly, societally, women's bodies are a source of shame. We are taught from an early age to hide any menstrual related products. You're supposed to hide it in your folders. When I was younger, it was in my Trapper Keeper, in the 80s. You hide the products in there. When you're pregnant, like, people look at you differently. It's seen as a valued life role, but not in the workplace. You're a liability. And the same with menopause, that you're seen as becoming a liability to the workplace. You're going to be a problem. And that embodied shame, the shame for our bodies over decades, means that we make ourselves small. Like, shame makes us hide, right? So we make ourselves smaller. We keep our voice quieter. We don't take up space. You've seen the images of like men as they sit and they spread out, and women are supposed to cross their legs and be small. We just are taught that over decades. And so by continuing to not talk about it, we reaffirm the idea that it is shameful. We don't then get the support from others, and that, finding out that there is all this other people that are having this shared experience, and we don't get the support that we need, whether that's medical or workplace support.
Wow. And Alicia, I've seen you cite this in your own work, referred to the late Sigal Barsadi, referred to the effective revolution in organizational science. And you were a huge part of that. You have been a huge part of that, where before it used to be kind of like, leave your emotions at the door when you come into the office, and emotions were not really validated mechanisms of the human experience. They were more kind of a state to be also swept under the carpet. And when we come into the office, we just have to use our minds and focus on cognitive processing and work and output. And this effective revolution, which you've been a huge part of, was really that, hey, we are actually regulating our emotions in the workplace. And we have to also include that when we think about how we're rewarded for our work, as opposed to not having it being acknowledged, which I think, as you were describing, in many of these service roles that are predominantly women were carrying out. And I wonder, the work you're doing now on the midlife crisis that many women are facing, the 3Ms of menstruation, maternity, and menopause. Well, really, that's not just midlife, that's throughout the life trajectory. Well, it seems like you're also saying, hey, this can't be swept under the carpet either. What is the similarity between the unwillingness of really predominantly men, who ironically have all been born from women and this reproductive process, but not wanting to acknowledge that, just as they before didn't want to acknowledge the emotions we experience at work?
Yeah, the two are very linked. And I've given talks where people ask me to talk about both my emotional labor work and the menopause work. And so I've had to really think about, what is the interconnecting thread there? And I think you've hit it. They're both things that are considered inappropriate for the workplace. And they're both gendered, right? Emotions, emotionality. If you tell a woman she's being emotional, you don't mean it as a compliment, right? I don't mean you, right? But
Yeah.
you're so emotional. It's seen as a liability. It's seen as something that's not appropriate. And the same with women's bodies. Like, we're supposed to pretend like we're not having any of these experiences that are integral to the female reproductive system. And so both of them are meant to be kept out and not discussed. And they're specifically female oriented, which is not an accident.
It's interesting, Alicia, if the research of Karl Pillemer, a gerontologist at Cornell University, he's interviewed people in their 70s, 80s, 90s, even centenarians, and asked them, well, what do you regret? Like, what would you do differently if you could live your life over? That sort of stuff. And what's interesting is that men, more often than not, will say, well, I wish I'd spent more time with my family. and not worked so much. And women, more often than not, will share, I wish I'd been more authentic about my own needs.
Yeah.
And I wonder, listening to you, and I'm really thinking like this kind of really this epidemic of women feeling unseen, unappreciated, devalued in the workplace. I think you're really shining a light on that. What are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, no, that really resonates. I think that part of what happens, and I know from my research, part of what happens in midlife is women start realizing there is no way to bend their bodies to fit into this ideal woman role in society. And after decades of trying to be a good girl or to be a good mother or to try to balance and have it all, right, as working women, by the time midlife and menopause roll around, you kind of realize there's nothing you can do to fit the expectation. So you think about like menstruating is stigmatized and having babies is stigmatized at work and you're a problem, but then menopause is too. And that's when you no longer are menstruating or having babies. So it is freeing to realize that there's no stage of life where you are suddenly seen as valued. And therefore,
Mm.
you might as well just be yourself.
They're not going to value you
I've
anyway, so just you might as well stand up and
just
be counted and be who you are.
stand up and be who you are. And I've said this I just really believe this, that as a society, we talk about menstruation as being when a girl becomes a woman and maternity being when the woman becomes a mother.
Mm.
Well, then menopause is when the woman becomes herself.
I
Right?
love that.
She's
That's
no
fantastic.
longer, put into a role. It's like, now is your time. If you're given the opportunity, now is your time to live more authentically. And we hear it in these interviews that we've done where basically women say during an interview, I just don't give an F what people think about me anymore. Like, they're just very direct about it. And that is the thing that I really wish I had understood as a young girl, that I just don't have to care what people think, because we're trained to care what people think. We're trained to be nice and
Mm.
worry that other people don't think we're nice.
Wow, I love it, Alicia, and I know that many of our listeners out there, especially our female listeners, and also the male listeners out there, who can be male allies for women in the workplace. And research shows that when women in the workplace have male allies, they stay longer and they're more engaged and they enjoy it more. So everyone here has a role to play. So this is Professor and Alicia Grandey from Penn State University, author of Emotionally Charged. Don't go anywhere. We're going to be right back after a word from our sponsors and continue this amazing discussion.
Is there a protective shell around your heart holding you back from the connection you know is possible in your life? It's time to find your path to redemption. Introducing Love and Suffering by Dr. Anthony Silard. In Love and Suffering, which has received 4 book awards in psychology and mental health and 99% 5-star reviews on Amazon, Dr. Silard overturns what we've been told over a lifetime about love, forgiveness, acceptance, and gratitude. New York Times bestselling author Adam Alter calls Love and Suffering a compelling roadmap for a more connected and meaningful life. When you order Love and Suffering, 100% of the author's proceeds are donated to nonprofit education programs in Africa and Latin America. Invite more love into your life today. Love and Suffering by Anthony Silard is available now at Amazon.com and wherever books are sold. What if everything you've been taught about happiness and friendship is wrong? The artoflivingfree.org, the learning platform of the Center for Social Leadership, would like to offer you 2 free books by Dr. Anthony Silard: The Myth of Friendship, How Your Misunderstandings About Friendship Keep You Lonely, and The Myth of Happiness, How Your Definition of Happiness Creates Your Unhappiness. Get your free personal copies of The Myth of Friendship and The Myth of Happiness today. It's simple and easy. Go to theartoflivingfree.org/free happiness and friendship books and enter your email, then confirm the confirmation email in your inbox. You'll receive the links to download The Myth of Friendship and The Myth of Happiness. Enjoy your 2 free books by Dr. Anthony Silard today at theartoflivingfree.org/free happiness and friendship books.
Hello, I'm Dr. Anthony Silard, your host of ReSocial, and I'm here with Dr. Alicia Grandey from Penn State University, who's also the author of the new book, Emotionally Charged. It's been a wonderful conversation here about emotion in the workplace and some of the circumstances that women have to face in the workplace, especially as they're experiencing their own bodily changes. And what really strikes me And this is related to a recent paper about why women are often leaving organizations, really, like especially high level executive women who no longer want to be in male dominated workplaces. And it's interesting because we have this whole lean in movement that Sheryl Sandberg, the former COO of Facebook, assembled, and really saying, hey, like, adapt to the work norms and you can succeed in many organizations. And what I'm seeing in my research is that these days a lot of women are leaning out rather than leaning in. They're like, look, I've had enough of, I'm not going to sacrifice family and children, and not just that, but also other interests in life rather than just being entirely focused on work. And what this recent paper found is that the reason a lot of women are leaving organizations is because they feel lonely there. And the reason they feel lonely is because they feel inauthentic. And I think this really speaks to the research you're doing and what you've been developing around women feeling like they can't show up as a holistic self at work. What do you think about that?
Well, I think first of all, the lean in movement has been there's some good kernels of points in there, but Jenny Hubler wrote an article with some colleagues, for example, on how each of those lean in ideas are not supported by our scientific evidence in terms of what is actually our choice versus what's kind of happening to us that constrains this. But the other thing is that, when we take a purely work or organizational lens and we see women leaning out as a problem because turnover and attrition is costly and problematic, and you lose intellectual property and so on, we're missing the larger lens, which is they may be leaning out from your organization. They may be leaving corporate organizations, but they may be leaning into something different. Right. So midlife is the end of reproductive capacity, right? As you're saying, but it is the beginning of a new type of productive capacity. You can now switch your energy to something else. And for many of the women we've interviewed that have gone through menopause or are in the process, and they were leaders in this research led by Mallory Decker and Eliza Barnes, and one of my grad students, Hannah Stockdale. We interviewed like 64 leaders, vast range of contexts, like military and government and corporate. And they described leaning out, but to do something that felt more meaningful and important to them, or to do something where they could feel more authentic, such as starting their own business, to do something that they could be in charge and change the culture of this smaller organization. So I think it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about women leaning out, it may be out of corporate organizations, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're stopping being productive contributors to the, society or to the workforce in some different way.
No, exactly. Also, there's a huge number of women that I found that are leaning in to different kind of workplace constellations, like working on project-based, being able to have more flexible schedules so they can not feel like they're abandoning their children, whereas men are more likely to say, well, it's okay, I've got to work. And we also, there's a lot of research showing that this sense of male work is sacred in our society, and we'll never question that. So for example, if you look at who's helping their elderly parents, well, they find it's both women and men. But then when it comes to missing work, then that's where it's like, okay, no, we don't touch male work. And women are the ones who are missing work to be able to take their elderly parents to doctor's appointments and so on. Well, in these women that you've interviewed, what would you share with our listeners about how are women successfully navigating menopause? As I'm listening to you, it really can't help thinking that you're kind of an emancipated woman. Like you from the way you described the way you felt in your life and working earlier, it was really like all these kind of constraints around you, and now you're no longer conforming to them. You're kind of creating your own lifestyle. And I wonder, what are you seeing in some of the other women that you've interviewed around successfully navigating menopause?
Yeah. And I would say it's an ongoing process to be emancipated. You're constantly reminded you're supposed to act a certain way. But I would say I've taken steps, and it's ongoing steps to feel more myself and liberated. First, just say I started off studying menopause in the workplace with the traditional view of menopause as symptoms, and that the symptoms constrain women in the workplace, right? And maybe they help to explain why women aren't getting promoted or or why they might choose to leave. And that research turned out a little differently than I expected. And I'd like to take just a sec to tell you, because it was kind of surprising. We found that when women were described as having hot flashes, which are prototypically menopausal symptoms, she is seen as, compared to a woman, same woman not having hot flashes, she is seen as less competent, less confident, and thus less leader-like, right? So that was like, okay, so menopause is stigmatized. That makes sense. But then we had another condition where we had her say, I'm menopausal. It's that time of life, to basically label those symptoms as menopause. And we assumed that would be even worse, right? Because you're talking about this taboo topic in this male context. And instead it was better. It actually completely undermined the negative. It made it so that it was almost as good as not having the symptoms at all. And she was now seen as more competent. And it was basically claiming her voice and saying, without shame, this is menopause. And then it was, okay, that's what's happening. And then she was seen as just as leader-like as the woman without the symptoms in the first place. Notably, not as strongly as the man in the room. So there's still the gender disparity there. So then that led to some further explorations where we started talking to women who already are leaders. So instead of focusing on symptoms constrain leaders, women leaders, how are women leaders navigating menopause successfully? So the best way I can describe it, that I think is fascinating, is as like a heroine's journey. You've probably heard about the Campbell's hero's journey,
Yeah,
like this
absolutely.
prototype or archetype, right, in leadership. So for menopausal women, it's like you start off with the challenge of the symptoms. Yes, that is true, that the symptoms kind of kickstart this tuning into one's own body and listening in a way maybe one hasn't in a long time, because you're tuned out to the kids and the elder care, as you mentioned. But by tuning in, you're questioning and you're asking, and you go on this quest of like, what is wrong with my body, right? Because it's so confusing, and medical providers are not trained and they don't know what to tell you. And you think you're just supposed to slap some hormones on there and you'll be fine. That does not work for everyone. It's not advisable for everyone. So then you form your ally team, like your Avengers, right? You have to find some other women who've gone through it, or some wise leaders, or people who can help educate you and give you strategies. And when our women leaders described that process, they came out the other side of that, having navigated being a leader and leadership being really important to them while going through the symptoms, with the help of allies and education and medical support, and coming out the other side transformed as more resilient, more strong self-concept, and more able to then use those skills as leaders, not just for themselves and their team, but to go back and change the workplace. And this is the end of the hero's journey, right? You go back home, you go back to your community, and you share what
nothing
you've
looks the
learned.
same, right? Yeah.
Right. You share and you transform now your context based on what you've learned about yourself. And for these women that we talked to, they made changes happen in the workplace. They changed policies, or they left to go do something they really were passionate about. We had one woman that left to start a business with pajamas that help with hot flashes at night, like.
Wow.
So
Okay. Yeah. So
it's this incredible journey if you have the resources, the time, the healthcare provision, and the status to navigate that successfully.
that's
And many
amazing.
women don't have that.
Wow. So, well, we're just about out of time, Alicia, but let me ask you, where can our listeners learn more about the wonderful work you're doing to help us improve our relationships?
Well, I've talked about these menopausal experiences and studies in some Harvard Business Review articles. So if you have a subscription at HBR, you can find those. And then in terms of managing our emotions in more effective ways, in ways that aren't harmful, I've written a book with Dina Denham-Smith, who is an executive coach. And I brought the science and she brought the real language that you can actually enjoy reading. And it's Emotionally Charged: How to Lead in the New World of Work, when leaders need to know how to manage their own emotions as well as help their people navigate theirs.
Okay, that's wonderful. Well, menopause is not the end of women's professional and relational potential. For many, it's the moment when they finally claim it. When we stop treating midlife women as problems to manage and start treating them as women who know themselves, who set boundaries, and who contribute from authenticity, everyone builds stronger, more honest relationships. Alicia, my day's been a better one because of the connection we further developed here. I really appreciate how you've helped our listeners to better understand some of the situations and bodily changes that women experience, and how both women and men can adapt in the workplace to make it a more inclusive and authentic space for everyone. So thank you, Alicia, for joining us here at ReSocial.
Thank you. And yes, women, you're not alone, and you're not crazy, and you're not broken. It's real.
Wow.
It's happening. There are ways through it.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's end the way we always do. Until we meet again, please remember that between you and the CMSRs, the compassionate, meaningful, sustainable relationships you desire in your life, lies an invisible social barrier you construct in your mind. It's entirely up to you to push through this barrier and watch it disappear into the mist. Be the change you desire and reach out to another person. Then use the tools you learn, refine, and align with your own values in ReSocial to develop a CMSR. Be kind, be generous, and be caring. I'm Dr. Anthony Silard. Thank you for joining us on ReSocial. I'm looking forward to being together with you again next week in the world filled with CMSRs we are creating together.